Thanks, Jenna. That was excellent. Next up, we have Michele Macready. Michele is Illume Consulting's founder and principal consultant. She works with high-tech startups, social enterprises, and Fortune 500 companies to create adaptive strategies that change at the speed of business, accelerate delivery of technology products to market, structure and deliver client services, and facilitate the creative process. Again, Michele has a list of accomplishments that's far too long to go through here in their entirety, but some include working with the Joint Chiefs of Staff to model a new military structure, moving away from command and control to a distributed, adaptive decision-making process. And she worked with Procter & Gamble to create a more efficient global supply chain through complexity science models. I'm going to say it. Michele currently works with CEOs of video games and social gaming startups to develop innovative business strategies and associated business plans, and is on the board of advisors for several social enterprises and high-tech startups. Please welcome Michele.
So how do we lead? How do we innovate? And how do we solve some of the big challenges that are facing us today in a world that's more and more complex every day? I'd like to share with you some of the things that I've learned in my experience working with complex adaptive systems and in the technology space about leadership. So first of all, I think it's important to understand the difference between complicated systems and complex systems. As an example of a complicated system is a factory line. So just imagine a factory line that's maybe producing cars or airplanes or something at the end. If you know what the raw materials are going into the process, and if you know what's happening along the way, what the processes are along the way, then you can pretty well predict that it's going to be a car or an airplane at the end of the process. It's a relatively predictable process, and a management hierarchy works really well in that situation. That's as opposed to complex adaptive systems, which are things like open source software. So you may have heard of open source software. Often it is developed collaboratively with people from around the world who've never even met each other. So they're developing this software, and they're working together, but they've never even actually met. So open source software is a great example of this because it's self-organizing. Self-organizing is really important because that means there isn't a management hierarchy that's telling all the people who are writing open source software what to do in the process. It's self-organizing, and with simple rules at the beginning of the process, you get some really interesting emergent properties and things that are not necessarily predictable at the end of the process. So here's another example of a complex adaptive system in nature, and that's bird flocking behavior. So let me ask you a question. Who in the audience has ever seen a single bird fly into a window? Anybody has ever seen that? Most people have seen that, yes. Unfortunately, it's sad, but we've all seen it. So who in the audience has ever seen a flock of birds fly into a window? No one. And that's partially because bird flocking behavior is an example of a complex adaptive system. They're very robust and resilient, and they handle obstacles really, really well. And what results is these really beautiful emergent properties and patterns. They're really, really interesting, and they're not really predictable. So it's really important in these complex adaptive systems that it's based on the simple rules that you get these really interesting emergent results. And this happens without a management hierarchy. So can you imagine if this bird flocking pattern had the lead bird trying to micromanage all the other birds? If the lead bird had to turn to all the other birds and say, hey, you on the right, slow down, you on the left, speed up, the whole process would fall apart. And that's because it's a complex adaptive system. So what does this mean from a leadership perspective? I think there's a few things that we can learn from a leadership perspective. One is that we're not in a world where there's only complex systems or in a world where there's only complicated systems. There's actually both. We see them both every day. So it's important for us as leaders to understand and really take a look at when we're using the processes for complicated systems and that we're using those at appropriate times, and that's command and control and management hierarchies. And when we're actually really dealing with a complex adaptive system where a management hierarchy isn't going to work. So we actually need a distributed and emergent process of behavior. It's also important, and I've learned in my leadership experience, that many systems are both at the same time. In the real world, you actually have to use a management hierarchy for some things, and then the distributed and emergent processes for other things. So why is this interesting now? Why today? The reason I think that it's really interesting now is I'll give you a little bit of history. About 10 or 15 years ago, I was working with MacArthur Fellows and leading scientists to solve business problems and problems for the U.S. government based on complex adaptive systems. But if you remember 10 or 15 years ago and what the world was like, Google had just been incorporated as a business. We had no Facebook, no Twitter, no social media, no smartphones, blah, blah, blah. So the technology had not really caught up yet with the complex adaptive systems science. In the last 10 or 15 years, I've been working a lot with high-tech companies in the video game, mobile phone, e-government software space. And what I found is that only in the last couple of years has the technology really converged with the science. And so now we have social media, Facebook, Twitter. We can connect with people from around the world that we've never met at the speed of light. And in a world of 7 billion people, I read a statistic recently that said there are 5 billion cell phones. So we're really connected at a level that we never were before. In the future, I think this is going to continue and even increase. We're going to have machine-to-machine communications where sensors in the roads are telling us traffic to avoid, and we'll have sensors that are talking to our doctors and reporting our heart behavior patterns as well from a health perspective. I read a statistic as well that said that by 2025, we'll have 50 billion connected and adapted sensors and machine-to-machine processes. So, what are some examples of these self-organizing systems in the real world? I'm sure you guys have all heard about what happened with Arab Spring and that was partially organized through Facebook and Twitter. Occupy Vancouver is self-organizing. There are a lot of things in the virtual space that are self-organizing as well. So if you think of online games like World of Warcraft, people come together that have never met and solve really complex challenges in the virtual world by working together and self-organizing. They do this because it's fun and challenging. You get to level up, you get rewards, you get feedback instantly. So there's a lot of things here that I think we can apply as well. Even from a crowdfunding perspective, if you look at sites like Kickstarter, Kickstarter is an example of a self-organizing crowdfunding behavior where people are actually giving money to projects in the art and design space. And they have recently, in the 2 years since they have started, have received $100 million to fund, from 1 million people to fund 10,000 projects. So there is more and more self-organization going on in the world every day. So I'd like to wrap up with a few things from complex adaptive systems that I think leaders can learn in terms of how leaders adapt, and then a few things that I think we as voters and citizens can do because our actions have huge impact on the results of complex systems. So 3 things I think that leaders can do. One is to really utilize and harness the power of connectivity and really take a look at where technology can help solve some of these problems. So we see a lot of governments publicizing open data, and we already see self-organization around that where people are writing apps and solving problems using this technology. I think it's important, though, for us as leaders to take a look and see what technology is actually going to be scalable in the sense that as more people are using it, we solve more and more problems. So I think that's one area that can help. A second thing is that I think it's important for us as leaders to take a step back and say, we're not always in control. So it's kind of time to relinquish control and realize that in these systems we're not always in control, and to actually use that to our advantage, and to decide, is this a complex system or a complicated system, and use the appropriate style. And then lastly, I think it's also important to understand that complex systems are always existing on the edge of chaos. Stuart Kauffman, one of the founders of complexity science in the Santa Fe Institute, talks about how complex systems exist on the edge of chaos. And this means that if there are too many rules, they stagnate. And if there are not enough rules, they fall off the cliff and descend into chaos. So it's really important for leaders to understand and walk that delicate balance between order and chaos. And then I think it's also important, lastly, for us as voters and citizens to realize that our actions as we work together and communicate with others in the system have really big impacts and create emergent property. So we need to really make sure that we're doing the right thing from that perspective as well. So I think there's 3 things, there's many things, but I'll just give 3 examples as to what we as voters and citizens, I think, can do. One is to connect and participate and not be afraid to actually get out there and put your ideas out there and get feedback on those ideas. Solving little problems or big problems, whatever the situation is to work with our leaders and actually help solve the problems ourselves. The second thing is I think it's important for us to think about the impact of our actions because it's in a complex system, as we were talking about earlier, it's about the individuals and our connections, and this has emergent properties that are not completely predictable. So it's really good if we take a step back and say, how are my actions creating emergent properties on the system, and is this the result that I want to see? And if it isn't, maybe we actually have to adapt as voters and citizens as well. And then lastly, I think it's also important for us to encourage our leaders to take risks, and David was mentioning this earlier, but I think it's really important for us to encourage our leaders to take risks and experiment, because if you think about a mountain landscape process, if we don't want to encourage our leaders to just get to the tiny little innovations and the tiny changes by climbing the smallest peak that's closest to us. We want to actually get to the big innovations and solve the big challenges. That's the highest peak. But to get to that highest peak in a landscape, you often have to go through a few valleys. That means there's going to be risk, there's going to be experimentation, and there may be a few small failures along the way. So I think it's important for us as voters and citizens to encourage those big innovations and those big changes, and to realize that you have to go through a few valleys to get to the highest peak. If you'd like to learn more about complex adaptive systems and technology, feel free to talk to me afterwards. The September 2011 issue of Harvard Business Review has Embracing Complexity on the cover, and it talks about complex adaptive systems in business. There's lots of books and things like that as well. Feel free to connect with me on Twitter or via email. I'd love to talk to you guys and hear your thoughts at the break as well. Thank you very much.